Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on what public buyers can do to protect the health and safety of workers in their electronics supply chain. An extremely important topic for practitioners of socially responsible public procurement and, of course, for workers. This is the fourth webinar in a series of socially responsible public procurement intended primarily for public buyers. A few words about logistics before we get started. As you will have noticed, all participants are now on mute for the sake of sound quality, but we do encourage you to participate and to think about questions and comments during the presentations. So to ask a question or make a comment, please send a chat message to Martina Hooper, who will coordinate the questions and answers and read your questions and comments after the presentations. Please use a private chat function rather than a chat to everyone. And if you can also specify who your question is for, that would be much appreciated. And of course, you can also raise any technical issues that you have with Martina, again, through the private chat function. I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be available through the Electronics Watch website. First, I'd like to say a brief word about Electronics Watch. Electronics Watch is an independent monitoring organization that helps public sector organizations work together to protect the labor rights and safety of workers in their electronic supply chains. More than 250 public sector organizations in 7 countries now share the cost of monitoring electronic supply chains and coordinate engagement with industry through Electronics Watch to lower their costs and to maximize the impact. And we have seen direct improvements on conditions in factories employing many tens of thousands of workers combined on issues ranging from forced labor to wages and working hours as we work in collaboration with local monitoring partners. Now, education is vital to this process, and this webinar series sheds light on some key issues for socially responsible public procurement. The first webinars this year address supply chain transparency, responsible mining, and the risk of employee suicides in the electronic sector in China. Again, all these webinars are available at the Electronics Watch website. And coming up, we also look forward to the Electronics Watch annual conference on December 11 in Amsterdam. This is the only conference in Europe, we believe, that focuses on connecting leading practitioners of socially responsible public procurement with labor rights monitoring partners from electronics production regions globally. Public buyers hear directly from these monitoring partners about workers' experiences and conditions in their own supply chains. This immediate connection to the reality on the ground is vital to improving the social responsibility in supply chains and to making a difference of workers and their communities. So we will encourage you to register for this conference, and you can do that in response to an invitation that you will all shortly receive. So over to today's presenters and today's topic. Today's topic, again, is the health and safety of workers in electronic supply chains and what public buyers can do to ensure compliance with health and safety standards to protect workers. You will learn about the key issues of health and safety in an industry that is often still seen as a clean one, and you will learn about how one public buyer, the national network of county councils and regions in Sweden, identify risks to workers and address them in the procurement process. So now I have the great pleasure to introduce to you our expert presenters, both of whom are also members of the Electronics Watch Board of Trustees. The first presenter will be Sanjeev Pandita. He is a well-known activist and expert in occupational and environmental safety and health, and has won international awards, including from the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, and recognition in 2008 as one of the 50 most influential environmental health and safety leaders. His writings on grassroots workers' movements and workers' health issues have been published widely, and he works with grassroots groups across Asia on hazards along the supply chain. Among other things, he played an important role in the establishment of the Asian Network for the Rights of Occupational and Environmental Victims, a unique grassroots health and safety network in Asia. So Sanjeev will be our first presenter today. And following Sanjeev, Pauline Göthberg will present, and she is a national coordinator for the Swedish Councils and Regions work on sustainable public procurement. Pauline leads the national work in Sweden and collaborates with global actors within the healthcare sector. She holds a PhD in business administration from the Royal Institute of Technology, where she focused her research on corporate social responsibility. Within the framework of the National Collaboration for Sustainable Procurement, the Swedish councils and regions have identified 8 prioritized risk areas, of which ICT is one. So thank you very much to both presenters for being with us today. And we will now first turn it over to Sanjeev for his presentation.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Bjorn, for a nice introduction. I will go through the first. I will just quickly try to introduce what ANROEV is. Asian Network for the Rights of Occupational and Environmental Victims is a network predominantly led by victims of occupational and environmental disease or injury. It has more than 100 organizations that are spread around 16 Asian countries and regions. And electronic victims and their organizations are a key part of the network. And I should also say, many of the new organizations and victims that are joining the network in the past 4 to 5 years, a large number of them are coming from the electronic industry. So there is a shift in the network. In the past, there used to be more accident victims, but now we are seeing more and more occupational disease victims, and lots of them from the electronic sector. So I will quickly go through, I think many of you may already know this, how this electronic industry has been moving into Asia and globally. It has undergone a paradigm shift. Many of you would know that the companies in the past would manufacture everything in one block. Like if somebody was manufacturing computers, they would also write the software, and they would also make all the accessories of the computers at one place. But then this whole areas of specializations developed, and what we call something like Wintellism, like Intel makes chips, Windows makes computers, but then also the supply chain is complex with different companies and organizations specializing on a particular part or a particular component. That has led to a very complex subcontract manufacturing chain, which is perhaps one of the most difficult to monitor. And then I go about electronic manufacturing in Asia. So as many of you would know, Asia is the largest manufacturer of electronics products, and a majority of electronics workers are in Asia, a large number of them in China, but also in other countries like Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam. And electronics constitutes a major manufacturing sector for many of the countries, at Philippines, Malaysia, and it is also a big foreign exchange earner for many of the countries. And needless to say, Chinese electronic industry is the largest in Asia. It overtook Japan, and it's roughly 3 times the size of the electronic industry in Southeast Asia. Now, electronic industry as a clean and green industry. As you know, the present electronic industry was born in San Jose, Silicon Valley in 70s. when companies like Intel, IBM started manufacturing and processing or producing chips there. From the beginning, it positioned itself as a clean and green industry. Absence of stacks and smoke, and clean air-conditioned rooms always gave a look that it's a very clean industry. And workers in bunny suits often gave an impression that there's a lot of protection for the workers. As you can see, this is an ad being produced at that time. It says that the air in this room must be 1,000 times cleaner than that of an operating room. This is a clean room, where chips are made. And often the air is passed through filters that takes away the dust, because this is more to protect the chip rather than the workers. So all the bunny suits these workers are wearing is not for their protection, but it is for the protection of the product. So most of the time they would inhale all the chemicals because those filters would not filter out the chemicals. And very soon this myth was also coming. I mean, people were realizing that this is not true. This industry is not as clean as it is portraying itself. You can see this is a New York Times article in 1984. I mean, there were worries about toxins in Silicon Valley, and very soon it became clear that it is not as clean and it is very hazardous industry. So some of the key health hazards in the electronic industry, I'm just listing them out. Uh, One of the main hazard is the chemical hazard, because what we see, this is predominantly a chemical industry with hundreds of chemicals that are being used in different processes and different parts manufacturing. Radiation hazard, because there is a lot of use of radiations like lasers, X-rays, and other forms of radiation. Uh, Hazards due to stress and overwork. There is a lot of target, long working hours, isolation. We have seen what has happened in some of the factories in China, that where the workers are under so stress and isolation is so severe that there we have seen lots of suicides. And finally, it's the end of the product. I mean, because there is no responsibility at times for the manufacturers to take care of the end product. So there's a huge problem of e-waste and its exposure to surrounding communities. Excuse me. So I will focus more on electronics that are used, chemicals that are used in electronic industry, because this is a very big problem, and the exposure, it's exposing millions of workers to hazardous chemicals. So there is a new report, analysis report by researchers working with International Campaign for Responsible Technology, ICRT. It's again a global network which is working towards making the industry more responsible. It has found that there are more than 1,109 chemicals known to be used in production, where many were identified as very hazardous. I mean, 330 of those are acutely toxic, 32 of them are carcinogens that can cause cancers, 60 are endocrine disruptors, I mean, making changes in our hormones. 41 are germ cell mutagens that can be passed to the next generation, and 46 are reproductive toxins. So I have just listed some of the important, or some of the chemicals or the metals that are hazardous. There are metal and metal compounds. I'm just listing, I won't go through the details. There's arsenic, there's cadmium compounds, there's chromium compound, especially the hexavalent chromium, which is very seriously toxic, cobalt compounds, lead compounds, nickel compounds. They can be all carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive and developmental hazards. Then we have solvents. There is trichloroethylene. It was used in Silicon Valley. It's continued to be used in many parts of Asia. You must have heard about Taiwan, RCA, Radio Corporation of America. They were using trichloroethylene in a large quantity, and it was exposing workers, and there are lots of cancers. Epichlorohydrin, ethylene dichloride, ethyl chloride, trichloromethane, chloromethane, halothane. There's some of the solvents, and then there are other chemicals like benzene, formaldehyde, hexane. N-hexane, you must have heard because lots of suppliers of Apple were using it, and it was reported quite widely a few years back. Exposure to N-hexane caused lots of poisoning in the supply chain which was connected to Apple. Toluene, methylbenzene, indium phosphate, hydrazine, vinylbenzene, methylbutylketones. So these are some of the chemicals I have just listed. I mean, if you want more information, I can send you more details of the chemicals. But what is actually happening at the ground? Workers are getting exposed to chemicals, but the problem is they don't know. There is very little information at the ground level about most of the time workers are not sure what chemicals they're using. I mean, if I go back to that N-hexane case in China, when workers were using it, they didn't know even its specific or the chemical name. They would call it, but most of the time they just know its local name. They are not aware of its chemical name or its what we call it, medical safety data sheet. They are not aware of its short-term or long-term effects. And information sometimes either is absent or it's not provided in local language. You can see this is how most of the time the containers are there. They're not labeled and workers are not sure what it's being used. I mean, this is a typical picture from an electronic fab. You can see there are wafers here and they are manually dipping them into solvents or with acids. And this is one of the very hazardous place in the semiconductor assembly or manufacturing, exposing these workers, because these masks are not going to protect them from the thin molecules of the chemicals here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, give you some faces about the people who are suffering. You see, this woman, her name is Yvette Flores. She was working in electronic manufacturing in San Jose in 70s, and she was exposed to some of the chemicals while she was pregnant. And this is her son, Mark, who's a severely disabled son. I mean, he's 20 plus, but his mental capacity is not more than 3 years or 4 years child. His brain, I mean, once she was exposed during pregnancy, it affected the development of Mark. Similarly, you can see these are the pictures of the people, of the workers, and many of them as young as 20s and 30s, who worked in the electronic industry in Korea, got exposed to chemicals at workplace, and died of different varying occupational diseases, cancers. And as I said, there we are seeing increasing cases of poisoning in China. In past few years, many cases of poisoning and cancers have been reported in electronic supply chain in China, exposure to N-hexane, benzene, and other solvents. And we are seeing the numbers are increasing, and so is the recognition. If you see the list of compensable diseases in China, number one is occupational lung diseases, but number two is occupational poisoning. So the chemical poisoning at workplace is the second leading compensable disease in China. And a lot of them, a large number of them are from electronic industries. Yet, majority are not diagnosed. So the reality is that most of the workers who are exposed and who are getting sick, do not receive the kind of diagnosis because, it's very difficult, especially in this part of world, to get a correct diagnosis on occupational disease. And this is, this I can just show you with an example. You see, China, it only reports 180 accidents annually. Uh, and then the fatal accident estimate by the ILO is 97,000. And similarly, work-related disease estimate is quite high than what is being reported by the different countries. So there is a huge difference between what countries report or what countries compensate and what may be the actual number of diseases. We still do not know how many people are getting sick because we have no data. But there is some estimate data which is based on WHO and the ILO models which they have built. So according to this, you can see if we take number of global fatalities, how people are getting exposed or sick at work, uh, we can see majority of the workers are, the large number of diseases are cancers, you see, work-related cancers, and a large number of cancers are resulting of exposure to the occupational hazards at workplace, including the chemicals. This is a similar data. I just want go quickly through it. Uh, at last, I want to also give you a small update on United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Hazardous Substances. This was done in past 2-3 years, and Baston is the person who did it, who was the special rapporteur. The aim was to look uh, at the implications of human rights and environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances. I have given the link. You can later on see the report in detail, and this report has recently been submitted to the Human Rights Council, and this sets a human rights framework for protection of workers in the supply chain from exposure to harmful substances. I will not go through the whole detail of the report because you can go through, but just quickly, what we have been raising from the ground to certain extent has been recognized by this report, and this will provide us an overall framework for the business and human rights, especially in the electronic sector, because it recognizes the right of a worker uh, that they should not be exposed to hazardous substances at work. And it also recognizes the underestimation of occupational diseases because there is lack of diagnosis, especially in developing countries. So we really do not know people who are being exposed, how many are getting sick, and lack of data does not mean people are not getting sick. So there is,
just to let you know, Sanjeev, that you've just got about a minute left. So
okay, all right, I'm about to finish.
Brilliant, thanks.
So so the workers' rights are human rights. The harms of chronic exposure are often invisible, and it will take years or even decades for adverse health impact to become manifested. There are some rights like right to safe and healthy working conditions, and how one of the most important thing, and I will end with that, how things would change. There may be very well written codes, there may be lots of well written laws, but the problem is they're not implemented. And one of the major impediment for implementation is right to information participation association. That means unless and until we involve workers and their organization in managing and in a meaningful manner in managing their health and safety, this is very difficult to implement. I would not go all the slides because I have just kept them for the information. So I will end my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sanjeev. Pauline, if you'd like to share your screen now, we'll hand over to you.
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, fine, yep.
Good. Okay, I'll start there. All right. Okay, well, good morning, everybody from Stockholm. And thank you, Sanjay, for a very interesting presentation. And thank you also for the invitation to share our experiences on how public procurement can be used as a political tool to address health and safety concerns in ICT supply chains. As we all know, there are many tools in the political toolbox, and public procurement is more and more being used as a policy tool to address human rights risks and labor rights risk in global supply chains. My presentation today will focus on three things. First of all, the Swedish County Council's collaborative model for sustainable public procurement. I will especially highlight Stockholm County Councils and their national responsibility area of ICT, and how they have developed award criteria for reducing chemical risks in products, but as well as in the manufacturing process. And end with some final thoughts or food for thought. There are three democratic levels in Sweden, and the main responsibilities for the Swedish county councils are healthcare, dental care, and public transportation. We procure goods and services to the amounts of 13 billion euros a year, and many of those products are manufactured in countries where the risks for human rights violations are high and where there is a high risk for negative effect on the environment. And the county councils have since 2010 cooperated on a national level, which is much more cost effective. I mean, we are 21 county councils and should not invent the wheel 21 times. So we have developed a collaborative model where we share the cost of resources. We cannot expect procurement officers to be experts on human rights and environmental risk, and therefore have developed standardized human rights requirements. And since we have the same supplier base, we can co-finance audits and share the results. But we don't only share the results internally, the results will also become publicly available, because we believe that transparency to citizens is an important aspect. Obviously, that has to be balanced with the intellectual property of the suppliers. So why is this important? Well, first of all, I think we have a moral obligation not to conduct healthcare in Sweden if it is to the detriment of people's health in other countries. But also, states has an obligation to protect human rights. According to the United Nations guiding principles, we should promote respect for human rights by business enterprises with which we conduct commercial transaction. And also in the Agenda 2030 clearly states that we should promote public procurement practices that are sustainable. Also, when it comes to the legislation, in 2007, new provisions on legal working conditions came into force in Sweden. So it's obligatory to require ILO's core convention when work is carried out outside of Sweden, and obviously if there is a risk of substandard worker conditions. But I would also say that it's a matter of pure risk management. I mean, inhumane conditions in factories that produce goods for the Swedish hospitals is not only an economic risk, it is a reputational risk, and therefore I would say a political risk. Finally, I would say that apart from the legal and moral obligations, I think we have an excellent opportunity to use our joint buying power to create a demand and a market for sustainable products and services. So what is sustainable public procurement? Well, for us, it can be made of different things. So for us, it's basically 4 responsibility area. Our code of conduct that has been politically decided is based on the Global Compact 10 principles. So it's human rights, labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. When it comes to the environmental demands, the requirement varies depending on what products we're buying and what kind of risks there are. But when it comes to the social risk, we have developed standardized requirements. So we are enforcing the code of conduct by including it into our terms of contracts. We also developed a standardized method for follow-ups. I mean, we will check that policies and routines are in place, but we will also check if these policies and routines are applied for identifying and mitigating human rights risks. So we do that by looking at documentations, such as risk analysis, audit reports, corrective action plans, and this requires full transparency from our suppliers. We can also do on-site audits in factories. And if any violations are found, we will always ask for rectification. You know, we can impose fines, we can impose standstill period, and if all these avenues fail, we can terminate the contracts. But that will always be a last resort, because if we do not have a contract, we have no means of helping those whose rights are being abused. So this is a little bit how the collaborative model looks in theory and on a policy level. So the important aspect is, of course, how well it works in practice, and the proof is, I would say, always in the proverbial pudding. So let's focus on the Stockholm County Council's work with risk within the ICT sector. Obviously, the county councils buy many products and services, and there are many risk areas, but we have chosen to prioritize 8 of those, of which ICT is one. And according to the National Division of Responsibility, Stockholm County Councils has the responsibility for ICT. Of course, they work with other risk areas as well, such as, you know, transport, building, construction, but ICT is their national responsibility. So what does this division of responsibility entails? Well, first of all, it's about conducting a risk analysis, including human rights, labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. And based on those risks, an action plan is developed, which includes prioritizing what risks to address, to make goals for those risks, and then decide on yearly follow-ups, what kind of industry dialogue to conduct, and also develop methods for addressing specific risks. I will get back to that a bit later. So just take a look at the Stockholm Action Plan for ICT. Well, first of all, this is just some general information describing contact information, what products are in focus, and what development goals we are addressing. Then we will just describe the supply chain for that specific category, the main steps, you know, from minerals to assembly, distribution, and recycling. And then the risks are prioritized and mapped according to where in the supply chain they occur, and also under what area, so human rights, environments, etc. So the risks associated to today's seminar is highlighted here. It says high usage of chemical and toxic metals in component production plants pose a risk for workers and the environment. Local communities suffer from air and water pollution. So these are the prioritized risks. And then Stockholm also set goals for each of those risks. So connected to the risk I just mentioned is discharge of chemicals or explosions fire may pollute the environment and impact nearby communities. And also environmental and health and safety related risk in sub-tiers should be part of brand supply chain due diligence, and follow-ups should pay particular attention on how brands manage their risk in sub-tiers. Also, health and safety issues remain a high concern in ICT production, especially due to the use of chemicals and other hazardous substances. So follow-up will pay particular attention on how brands manage these risks in sub-tiers. So these are the goals that are set within the action plan. So the next step in the action plan is also to decide what activities should be conducted each year. So year 3, as you can see, well, it's 2018 this year. Stockholm focus on obviously the continued membership in Electronics Watch, which is very important. Continue doing follow-ups, but also the one that it says stakeholder dialogue on award criteria and doing a pilot. So how can you incentivize the market and steer towards certain risk-based goals with public procurement? Well, you can of course use contract clauses already mentioned and make sure you follow up during the contract period, but you can also develop award criteria that premiere those suppliers that are more progressive, or do both, you know. So I would end with a slide that shows Stockholm's latest procurement of ICT and how they have developed award criteria. So Stockholm County Councils has started 3 separate procurements of computers, displays, and thin clients. So the contract periods are for 2 + 2 years. The value of the previous procurement has been used as a reference, so it's 9.5 million euros. And in the planning phase, it was also decided that the sustainability criteria should be valid at a price-quality ratio of 70-30. So in the table in the lower right-hand corner, you can see an example of how suppliers could get a price reductions for fulfilling those environmental and social criteria. And also, Stockholm has developed and implemented award criteria to address the risk for chemical, both in the products, but also in the process of manufacturing. So to premiere those suppliers that were more advanced. So I would just highlight two of those demands that focus on the manufacturing process, which is, in my mind, progressive. So the first award criteria for processes was the substitution of chemicals according to the OECD listed methods, for example, the green screen. That's the method to move towards safer chemicals, but also to evaluate the alternatives to these hazardous chemicals. The other criteria is the requirement that suppliers should submit list of chemicals used in final assembly of offered products. So this is a requirement that aims to address the risk of chemical used in the manufacturing process and to just address the health and safety issues at the workplace. So SLL is in the middle of evaluating these bids, and hopefully next time when we have a webinar, my colleagues can talk about, how well the requirements work and the results, and maybe also in dialogue with you, improve how they can be improved. So these are some of the examples on how you can implement sustainability criteria in public procurement. I will just end with some final thoughts. And it's about, I would say sustainable public procurement is not just about the procurement phase and setting sustainability requirements. It's equally important that sustainability is seen as an integral part of the whole procurement process. So in the planning phase, for example, the market analysis should include identifying your salient sustainability risk. You also need access to expertise, both environmental and social. You need to have a market dialogue. You need to allocate resources of follow-ups and decide on your strategic goals for this procurement. I would say within the procurement phase, you choose what type of criteria to use. Is it contract clauses, award criteria to incentivize suppliers? Making these demands is necessary, but it's far from sufficient. So follow-ups is necessary to make sure that you actually get what you pay for. Office audits to check internal policies, but also factory audits. And last but not least, even if we procure goods and services to the amount of 13 billion euros, we are a small buyer on a global scale, and we therefore need to collaborate with other public buyers. So sharing expertise and knowledge is very important. And I think Electronics Watch is an important forum for that. So to develop more specific demands for chemicals in the manufacturing requires knowledge on conditions and risk in factories and what to focus on. And I think here the cooperation with the Electronics Watch members is of great value. So, thank you everybody for listening, and if you want more information, I would also suggest that you contact my colleagues, Kathleen McCaughey and Christian Hemström, for more information. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much to both presenters. Martina, you can hear me at this point?
Yes, I can, Björn.
Terrific. Again, thank you so much to Sanjeev and to Colleen. These were really terrific presentations, incredibly informative, and I can't believe that that we are still at 20 minutes. It feels like there was so much information and insight into these presentations. I should have lasted an hour, but they didn't, which is a great news because now we have time for questions and answers. Again, just to remind people, if you happen to tune in late, the way that you ask a question is send a private chat message to Martina Hooper. You'll see her in the participant list, who will then read your questions and comments. And try also to specify who your question is for, to Sanjeev or to Pauline, or perhaps to both of them. So with that, let's go to the first questions and answers. Martina.
Yeah, sure. So I've got a couple of questions for Sanjeev, first of all. Sanjeev, why do you see a shift from accident to occupational disease victims in ANROEV? I'll just unmute you now. Oh.
In past, most of the there was relatively less diagnosis of occupational disease, even though people were getting sick, but they didn't know they were getting sick, or they didn't know they were getting sick due to work. So they would die quietly back in their hometown, so they wouldn't know. So there is increasing awareness, and this is more in East Asia than in Southeast Asia. So I can say in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, you are seeing more and more occupational disease victims coming forward. And this has also to do with the awareness and the diagnosis. That's why we are seeing more chemical poisoning and cancer victims due to chemicals coming forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And another question. What do you see as the most promising steps by civil society and or government to create safer and less toxic workplaces in the electronics industry?
Okay. Actually, because of the time limit, I couldn't specify. There are three key components. One is the design. I think we have to look at the design process. Right now, this inbuilt obsolescence of the electronic gadgets means they last only for 6 months or even less, and it's getting shorter and shorter lifespan. So how can we build products that are going to last longer? And more importantly, at the design level, how can we build it as a part of the green chemistry? So we are not using, we are designing products which do not require toxic chemicals. That's at the design level. At the manufacturing level, how can we, I mean, as I pointed in my presentation also, the key component is how can workers and communities be equally involved in designing or in deciding their own future, because right now they're being excluded from this whole process. And that goes again to the right to information. You know, the industry at this point is not telling us what chemicals they're using. We are not getting a clear answer from the industry about the list of chemicals they're using.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I've got some questions for Pauline. So I'll just unmute you. So the first one is, what does price reduction mean, and how do environmental and HR considerations get quantified in a price?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's just the model which is being valued, and there's a price on how the suppliers fulfill the different requirements. So it's many. I mean, it's more than two that is shown in the table there. But if you want specific information on how that is done, maybe I could send that over to you or get you into contact with the person who's actually developed this.
Okay, thank you. And I have some more questions also for Pauline. Could you review any of the challenges with the tender you mentioned, or areas of resistance from the market? For example, on disclosure of chemicals used, and have companies been receptive to this process?
Yeah, again, I should really get my colleagues here to speak about it. But I know that, it started already in 2017, where there was a request for information. They had the industry dialogue and what kind of demands could be made at this point, and what could be fulfilled, etc. And what information could be actually we get from the industry. But again, I would suggest that those kind of like specific questions for this tender is directed to Kathleen or Christian. I think they're online at the moment. So
yeah, okay, thanks. And there's a question that's for any of you, including you, Bjorn, and that is there work around health and safety or toxic exposure about the electronics recycling industry? I'm not sure who wants to tackle that one.
I can just say a little bit, in the past, this whole, I know about US, whatever the recycling programs were there, they would actually export it all to China. So the recycling was not really working. And in China, it was being recycled in a very hazardous manner, in a very crude manner that was exposing far large number of communities as well as children, and including polluting the environment. But since China has stopped importing all the waste, now they are looking for it is going to other countries. So if you build a good recycling plant, I think the exposure, if you build a good recycling plant in the north, the level of exposure is less, but normally they tend to send it to the third world countries. So that's where the real exposure happens.
Okay, and I've got one more question for Pauline, which is, could you provide examples of occupational health and safety issues in electronics you have discussed in the stakeholder dialogue you referenced? How aware do you think your suppliers are of these issues in their supply chains?
Well, basically, I think the risks that we have identified are based on that risk analysis we did in the beginning. That risk analysis at the moment more based on research and reports, etc. So at this present time, yes, we have dialogue with the industry, but maybe not as structured. Now I'm talking for all the risk areas, not just ICT, where we involve, as Sanjeev said, like workers or other type of important stakeholders to identify these risks. So it's basically based on the reports, etc.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bjorn, there are no more questions, so I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, since we have a few more minutes of time, I'd love to ask a couple of follow-up questions. First, Sanjeev, you mentioned that that you see potentially more awareness among victims of occupational disease, that in fact what they're suffering is the result of something that they encountered in their workplace, some chemical or perhaps some other hazard that they met in their workplace. And you also mentioned that one of the sort of foundations for creating a safer industry in the long term, and for actually implementing and the laws and regulations and codes on occupational safety and health and chemical regulations, is that workers are informed, that workers can participate, and that workers know about what are the risks that they face every day at work. So do you potentially see that this greater awareness among workers that you mentioned, that maybe what they're suffering is connected to the workplace, also means that somewhere in some places workers actually are more informed about the dangers that they're facing, and that is a step that we could potentially build upon to create safer workplaces. In other words, have you actually seen particular places where you think that workers have better access to information than perhaps they did a decade ago?
Oh, yes. I mean, surely, I mean, if you see the first tier suppliers, I mean, many years back, you know, workers in the first tier suppliers wouldn't know what chemicals they're using. But yes, if you go to the first tier suppliers, they would know. There would be a proper training to workers, and they would try to include them through safety committees. So there is, and in many of the plants, there are these safety committees where workers are included, and they will themselves be engaged in processes. So, however, this doesn't happen in the, you know, the lower suppliers where they're smaller, and unfortunately now the industry is going down to the home-based level also. So increasing trend in China, we are seeing lots of products being assembled at the homes or at very small shops. So if in that trend, it's very difficult to follow the health and safety in a proper manner.
So where you see this progress, is this, are you talking about China right now, or are you talking about other regions?
I mean, China is, I mean, I can say is the most progressive, you know, despite so much inhibitions. I mean, what I have personally seen is there's lots of awareness, I mean, inside China in terms from workers and who demand more. So diagnosis is getting more, but yes, there is a difficulty in getting compensation. But also in many other parts like Indonesia, also Vietnam, the first tier or the bigger companies where they have a proper management, you would see some level the information about chemicals is provided. But then once you go to the smaller factories, which are the majority, unfortunately, then that awareness level goes low, and then the information is not provided. So the challenge is, how do we connect all these tiers so that all workers are equally aware about what they are using and what they are being exposed to? And as you said, it can only change if they are involved in the decision-making processes with regards to health and safety.
And unless, Martina, there are other questions that have come up, can I ask a follow-up to Pauline as well?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. So Pauline, building upon what Sanjay was saying and the importance of workers' right to know and right to information, is this something that the county councils that you work with, is this a right that you think can be part of the procurement, you know, enforceable through the procurement process as a worker tier, as a contract condition? Do you see any possibility of including that in the procurement process and then monitor that and follow up on that and enforce that?
Is raising, and much of the problem is that workers do not know their rights. We notice this in many different areas, and it's an interesting thought. We haven't used this kind of criteria to address that specific issue, but I think what we're moving towards is that rather than having standardized human rights or requirements, maybe we need also to develop specific criteria that address certain kind of risks or where we want to go. And definitely, I think, you know, the capacity building could be one of those. I don't see why it shouldn't. At least maybe could be put as an award criteria, for example, that you premiere those suppliers and actually show how they educate their staff, etc. So yeah, that could be a possibility for the future. We haven't used it, we haven't tried it yet, you know, this is early days because, you know, it's not long ago that, you know, all these kind of, at least human rights requirements were seen as could only be made as contractual clauses. Now we're looking into award criteria, you know, qualification criteria, etc. So yeah, something for the future.
Okay, so this is clearly a discussion that is to be continued. I want to thank Sanjeev and Pauline so very much for your very informative, rich and stimulating presentations, and for everybody who joined and took part. We can continue this discussion certainly at the Electronics Watch annual conference, again December 11 in Amsterdam. You will soon receive invitations to register, so please do register when you receive that invitation. And I should say also the next public report that is coming up is the report on suicide and employment conditions in the Chinese electronics sector. Some of you may have heard the webinar on that research back in May. We're preparing to release the report in about a month right now. So, or a little bit longer, but that's coming up, and then the conference. And it remains for me to also say that this webinar series is part of the Make ICT Fair project, which is funded by the European Union. And again, so we are grateful to the support from the European Union. And again, like all the other webinars, a recording of this webinar will be available shortly on our website. So thank you so much again to the presenters and to everybody who joined.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.